All right. Today I'm going to read from the book 3 Bags Full, Chapter 5. This has become quite an adventure for me. Natalie, the Good Shepherd. My husband found this book for me many, many months ago. I've been wanting to read it and just wasn't making the time, and it's amazing in life when we assign such things that we want to do for ourselves and yet invite others into it. Me reading this book for my mother, who has macular degeneration and can no longer read and who loves reading. I decided to go ahead and include my mom in this journey of reading this book with me as I read it to her. 3 Bags Full, Chapter 5, Cloud Kicks Out. These are long chapters, by the way. Long chapters. I'm like, come on. And I'm a fast reader. It's like 25 minutes. Let's get started. The sheep had spent a horrible day. Never in their lives before had they felt so adrift. First the mist, then the feeling that something strange was moving through that mist. And in addition, squelching sounds and a suspicion of hostile scents. The winter lamb had enticed the 2 other lambs into a dark corner of the hay barn on some pretext or other, and then terrified them so much that they ran into the wall in their fright and hurt themselves. One on the head and the other on a front leg. Richfield saw nothing, heard nothing, and just stayed put. Then the yelling began, and finally even the old lead ram had to admit that there was something wrong. He looked relieved, because at last he had picked up some of what was going on. The yelling was too much for the sheep. They raced out into the meadow and trotted through the mist, twitching their ears, too nervous to graze. They crowded together on the hill. Maud kicked out nervously and hit Rameses on the nose. In a sullen mood, they waited for the wind to drive away the mist, and with it the silence. They even missed the crying of the gulls. The wind rose. Around midday, the gulls began screaming again. Here's Cash with me right now. Oh, he's such a stinker. And Zora trotted over to the cliffs. She bleated, and soon all the sheep were standing as close to the abyss as they dared and gazing in amazement at the depths below. The butcher was lying there on a small patch of sand, in the middle of a great many rocks. He was on his back, and he looked surprisingly flat and broad. Richfield claimed to see a red trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth, but they weren't feeling kindly disposed to Richfield today and didn't believe a word he said. The butcher had his eyes closed and wasn't moving. The sheep relished the sight. Then the butcher's left eye opened, and their good mood instantly vanished. It looked at every single sheep, and even high up there on the cliffs they felt weak at the knees. The eye was searching for something, didn't find it, and closed again. Cautiously, the sheep retreated from the cliff tops. "He'll be washed away," said Maud optimistically. The others weren't so sure. "A young man always comes along the beach with his dog," Cordelia sighed. Several sheep nodded. They knew that from the Pamela novels. "The dog finds the person. The young man is enchanted and takes the person away," Cloud went on. She had always listened attentively. "At least he'll be gone then." She added. George had always told them the sea gives nothing back, as he threw boxes from the caravan over the cliffs at high tide. The young man, on the other hand, soon grew tired of the people they had found, even the fragrant Pamelas, so you could easily work out how soon they'd lose interest in the butcher with his sausage fingers. "Let's get Mopple the whale to tell the story of Pamela and the fisherman," said Lane. The others bleated in agreement. They loved the story about the fisherman because a gigantic haystack played the main part in it. Mopple told that story well, and when he'd finished, they would stand in awed silence, imagining what they would do in the haystack. But Mopple wasn't with them. They looked in the vegetable garden and in George's place. George's place was intact. They felt ashamed of thinking Mopple capable of such a thing. The sheep fell silent, at a loss. Then Zora trotted back to the cliffs, tail wagging restlessly, to see if there wasn't a round blob of white wool on the beach as well. Luckily, Mopple wasn't there. But the sheep's assumptions had been correct. No less than 3 young men were putting the motionless butcher on a stretcher. Zora shook her head at such foolishness. She bleated at the others, but no one dared watch the young men taking their heavy burden away. They remembered the butcher's eye and felt a chill. Gradually, it became clear that Mopple wasn't in the meadow at all. "Perhaps Mopple's dead," said Lane quietly. Zora shook her head energetically. "You don't disappear immediately just because you're dead. George was dead, but he was still here." They were all glad that Mopple's case was different. "He's turned into a cloud sheep," bleated Rameses excitedly. The sheep swiveled their heads to look up, but the sky was a uniform gray like a dirty puddle. He can't have disappeared, said Cordelia. It's as if the world had a hole in it. It's like magic. Heather scratched her ear with one hind leg. Perhaps he's simply gone away, said Maud. You can't go away just like that, objected Ramesses. No sheep can. They said nothing for a long time. They were all thinking the same thing. Melmoth went away, said Cloud at last. Heather lost her balance and fell over sideways. The other sheep looked away. They all knew the story of Melmoth, although no sheep liked to tell it and no sheep liked to hear it. It was a story that mother ewes whispered into their lambs' ears as a warning. It was a story without any kind of haystack in it, an impossible story, and it scared them all. Melmoth is dead, snorted Sir Richfield. The sheep jumped. They had been speaking very quietly, and no one had expected Richfield of all sheep to catch what they were saying. Melmoth is dead, he repeated. George went looking for him with the butcher's dogs. George came back smelling of death. I was the only one waiting by the shepherd's caravan when that 5th night came. I waited for him and I smelled death. No sheep may leave the flock. No one dared say anything in reply. Their heads sank one by one and they automatically began grazing. They would have liked to ask Miss Maple about Mopple, but Miss Maple wasn't there. They would have liked to ask Othello if there was anywhere to go beyond the meadow, because Othello knew the world and the zoo. But Othello wasn't there. Now they were confused. They wondered whether a predator was prowling around the flock and stealing the fattest, the strongest, and the cleverest of them. A predator without any scent. The wolf's ghost, for instance, or the goblin king, or the lord, whoever he might be. Sir Richfield decided to count the sheep. It was a tedious process. Sir Richfield could count only up to 10, and not always that, so the sheep had to stand in small groups. There were arguments, because some sheep would claim they hadn't been counted yet, while Richfield said yes, he had counted them already. All the sheep were afraid of being missed out of the count, because then they might disappear. Some of them tried to steal into other groups on the sly so as to be counted twice. Richfield bleated and snorted and finally came to the conclusion that there were 34 sheep in the meadow in all. They looked at each other, at a loss. Only now did they realize that they had no idea how many sheep there really ought to be in the meadow. The figure so laboriously worked out was completely useless to them. It was a great disappointment. They'd hoped they would feel safer after the count. George had always been so pleased when he had finished counting them. Excellent, he used to say, although sometimes he just said, uh-huh. In that case, he would march off either to the cliff tops to throw dry droppings at Zora, or to the vegetable garden to find a bold lamb pushing its neck through the coarse mesh wire netting and putting its tongue out. After he had counted the sheep, George always knew what to do. The sheep did not. Feeling frustrated now, Ramesses head-butted Maud, who bleated indignantly, as did Heather. Zora nipped her hindquarters. Strangely enough, Heather didn't react, but instead Lane, Cordelia, and the 2 young mother ewes all began bleating at once. Richfield's hooves were scraping up grass and earth. Lane nudged Maisie, the most naive sheep in the flock. Maisie almost fell over with surprise and then nipped Cloud lightly in the ear. Cloud kicked out and hit Maud's foreleg. All the sheep were offended and started bleating. Then they fell silent as if a secret signal, all except for Sir Richfield, who was butting everyone and calling for order. At that moment, Othello came along the footpath. He looked at them with mild surprise and trotted past them to the cliffs. The sheep exchanged glances. Cloud licked Maud's ears apologetically. Ramesses nibbled Cordelia's rump. The black ram looked down at the beach and the butcher-shaped imprint on the sand that the sea hadn't yet washed away. He put his head on one side. A moment ago the sheep had been full of questions, but suddenly none of them wanted to trouble Othello. It was enough to know that sheep who have disappeared can come back. They began grazing again with some enjoyment for the first time that day. 3 men met under the lime tree. One was sweating, the second smelled of soap, the third was breathing stertorously. Their fear prowled around them with gleaming eyes. "If Ham really snuffs it," said the sweating man, "we're done for, and no mistake." "Effin' madness," gasped the one with the noisy breath. "What a crazy risk, George. Well, who knows? But Ham lodged it all with the lawyer. He's not making empty threats." Their fear nodded agreement. "What stupid fool went and did a thing like that?" groaned the sweating man. "To Ham?" A waft of soapy air showed that the second man had made a sudden violent movement. "You think it was no accident?" "Sure, and that's what I think," whispered the sweating man, perspiring harder than ever. "Accident?" the rasping voice laughed. "Why would Ham fall off the cliffs? Sure-footed like he was. Why would he be up there anyway? I'll tell you what, someone lured him there. A whiff of violet perfume on a note of that stupid bastard Ham comes running." "But he won't be snuffing it," said the sweating man. "Tough as old boots his ham always was, thanks be to God. His chances aren't so bad, the doctors say. They reckon he won't be walking no more, but what matters is he's alive. Maybe he'll have forgot it all, after an accident like that." The soapy man's voice sounded optimistic. "Ham will remember," said the man with the rasping voice. "There mayn't be much gets into his head, but once it's in, it don't come out so quickly. When Josh got him all boozed up the evening of George's wedding, remember?" Perhaps the men were nodding. Perhaps they were trying to grin. Of course they remembered. Josh had put glass after glass in front of Ham, and Ham, who usually hardly touched a drop, tipped 'em down his throat one by one. How they'd laughed. Couldn't remember his own name, didn't even blink when a fly settled on his eye. And Josh got his money for every single glass, and then more'n he bargained for. "I wouldn't care for a walloping like that myself." The sweating man chuckled. He was getting on his companion's nerves. "When Ham wakes up, sure, he'll remember," said the man with the rasping breath, "and so it all goes on again." They said no more. Perhaps they nodded. Then they went away in different directions. Their fear smiled. It turned with an elegant movement. Its mane billowed around the trunk of the old lime tree, and it followed all three of them home. The lime tree was very old. It had once been in the middle of the village, and the villagers had danced round it. They had made blood sacrifices to it, and the tree had thrived and grown. Perhaps it had seen wolves. It had certainly seen the wolfhounds used by the new masters to hunt down game and cattle and human beings. Today it stood alone. It was still thriving. Its trunk was taller than 2 sheep's lengths. Mopple the whale was standing behind that trunk. He had come there because he felt safe under the tree. It was like being in a barn. He hadn't run away when the men came. Mopple knew now that running away didn't work. He simply went on chewing and mesmerized every word and memorized every word. Mopple wasn't thinking of the 3 men or the butcher, certainly not the butcher. Mopple was thinking of their fear. The men hadn't noticed it, but he had seen every one of its efficient movements as clearly as if the trunk of the old tree were transparent like water. It was bigger than a sheep, and it ran on 4 legs, a huge, strong beast of prey with a silky coat and clever eyes. Mopple hadn't been afraid of that fear. It wasn't his own fear, after all. A night bird sang. Evening was falling. Mopple thought of the other sheep and stopped chewing. Suddenly, he wanted to be back with his flock so badly that the thick wool behind his ears began to itch. It was high time for another sheep to nibble the back of his neck. That was more important than strange beasts of prey and yelling butchers. Of course, Mopple remembered the way he had come through the mist that morning, and his ears wagged happily up and down as he trotted home. Mopple didn't arrive until dusk. He seemed more thoughtful than usual, and he seemed thinner. It was the different way he moved. Some of the sheep ran to meet him with welcoming bleats. His absence had made them realize how fond they really were of Mopple the whale. He smelled particularly nice, the way only a totally healthy sheep with an excellent digestion can smell, and he knew the best stories. They bombarded him with questions, but Mopple was more silent than they had ever known him. A terrible suspicion hovered in the air that Mopple couldn't remember properly anymore, but no one dared to voice it. Mopple went to stand beside Zora, who nibbled the back of his neck in an absent-minded way. Darkness fell now, but the sheep stayed out in the open. They were waiting for Miss Maple. However, Miss Maple didn't turn up. Only when the round moon was high in the sky did the figure of a small sheep approach from the moors. A long, thin moonlight shadow trotted ahead of it. It was Maple, looking exhausted. Cloud gave her face a lick. "Into the hay barn, all of you," said Maple. The sheep crowded around her as they made their way into the barn. Moonlight fell through the narrow ventilation skylight on their expectant faces. Miss Maple leaned against Cloud and made herself comfortable. "Where have you been?" asked Heather impatiently. "Investigating," said Miss Maple. The sheep knew what investigating meant. They had heard the word in the detective story. During investigations, the detective delves into other people's business and gets into difficulties. Miss Maple told them how she had trotted along the road to George's house all by herself, right through the village where a car almost ran over her and a big red dog chased her. Then she had hidden herself under the gorse bush outside George's house and eavesdropped on a conversation through the open window. Maple's courage was quite astonishing. "Weren't you at all frightened?" asked Heather. "Yes," Miss Maple admitted. "It took me so long because I didn't dare come out of the gorse bush, but I heard a lot." "I wouldn't have been frightened," announced Heather with a sideways glance at Othello. Miss Maple told them how a great many people had been to see Kate from midday onwards, not all at once, but in small groups individually. They all said the same thing, how terrible it was, what a dreadful thing to happen. Now Kate must be strong. Kate hardly said anything, just yes and no, as she cried into a large piece of cloth. But then, very late in the evening, there was another knock, and it was Lily outside the door. Kate stopped crying. "How dare you?" she said to Lily. "I only wanted to say I'm sorry," whispered Lily. "Well, at least you didn't have him," hissed Kate, and she slammed the door in Lily's face. "Like an angry cat," said Miss Maple, "just like an angry cat." It didn't surprise the sheep. The Pamelas in those novels had often behaved in a bewildering and bad-tempered way, too. They quickly lost interest in the story that seemed to have fascinated Miss Maple so much. After all, they had other worries. "Did you have a nice day?" asked Maple, sighing, when she realized that no one was interested in her adventure anymore. The sheep looked embarrassed and told her what had happened during the day. "He had one eye open," said Lane. "The butcher was lying on the beach," added Maud. "Mopple didn't tell us a story," said Heather, looking crossly at Mopple. "He looked all flat," said Sarah. "We argued," said Cordelia. "Sir Richfield counted us," said Rameses. "Then the young men took him away with them," said Zora. Miss Maple sighed. "Let Mopple tell me about it," she said. "Mopple wasn't here," said Cordelia. Maple looked surprised. "And Othello wasn't here," Heather sighed. Miss Maple looked inquiringly at Othello. Othello told them about the strange garden and how George had been buried in a box. A murmur ran through the flock. "They don't have a pit there, but the dead don't just decay either. It looks more like a garden, not a vegetable garden, but a garden anyway, and all very tidy. And do you know what they said about that garden?" Othello looked round at them, his eyes sparkling. "They said it belonged to God." The sheep stared at each other in horror. "Fancy planting dead people in your garden?" They liked God less and less. "It was him," murmured Richfield. Maple glanced at the ram. He looked old, much older than usual, and the great curves of his horns seemed too heavy for him. "They weren't sad, those people," Othello went on. "Excited, yes, very excited, but not sad. Nervous. Black and talkative as ravens, and we all know what ravens eat." The sheep nodded, grave-faced. "The butcher wasn't there, and they are wondering about that. They won't be wondering about it any more now." Othello thought some more. "Otherwise, they were all there, Kate and Lily and Gabriel, Tom, Beth, and God, and lots of people we don't know. The thin man who came and found George first with the other three is called Josh Baxter. He's the pub landlord." They all looked at Miss Maple, but the clever ewe just rubbed her nose thoughtfully with one front leg. The sheep were disappointed. They had expected the hunt for the murderer to be more exciting, easier, and above all quicker. Like in the Pamela novels, where soon after every mysterious death, an equally mysterious stranger would turn up, a man with a thin, scarred face or cold and restless eyes. Generally, he wanted Pamela for himself, but with a little practice it was easy to tell that he was the murderer, and 2 or 3 pages further on, at the latest, a handsome young man would kill him in a duel. But today's events seemed more like a real detective story, and George had thrown that book away without finishing it. They had been disappointed at the time, but now they wondered whether they hadn't been a better idea than racking your brains over it every day in vain. "We must find out what sort of story this is," said Cordelia. The others looked at her inquiringly. "I mean, every story is about different things," Cordelia explained patiently. "The Pamela novels are about passion and Pamelas. The fairy tale is about magic. The book about the diseases of sheep is about the diseases of sheep. The detective story was about clues. Once we know what sort of a story this is, we'll know what to look out for." They looked at each other, embarrassed. "Let's hope it's not a story about the diseases of sheep," bleated Maud. "It's a detective story," said Miss Maple with conviction. "It's a love story," Heather bleated suddenly. "Don't you all see? Lily and Kate and George. It's just like with Pamela. George doesn't like Kate. He likes Lily. But Kate likes George. And there's jealousy and death. It's perfectly simple." In her enthusiasm, Heather allowed herself to frolic like a lamb. "Well, yes," said Miss Maple cautiously. "Only then Lily ought to be dead, not George. There'd have been a duel, and the rivals would have tried to kill each other. You don't fight the person you love. You fight whoever wants to take that person away from you. But," she added, seeing Heather's disappointed face, "I did think of that, too. The story smells like it, in a way, only of course that doesn't make sense." "It is a love story," Heather repeated obstinately. "Suppose George was one of the rivals," asked Othello, "fighting for Lily. Or perhaps he was defending Kate." Miss Maple put her head thoughtfully on one side, but she didn't seem to want to say any more about it. Much later, when most of the sheep were asleep, Mopple, who for the first time in his life couldn't drop off easily, looked through the open door of the hay barn and saw the shape of a sheep standing motionless on the cliffs and looking out to the sea. It was Maple. Mopple went to join her. They stood side by side in friendly silence for a while. Then Mopple told her about the horrors of the day, and Maple said nothing. "It stretches on and on for a very long way," she said at last. Mopple sighed. "Sometimes it scares me a bit, looking out to sea for a long time. As long as Zora, I couldn't do that." "I didn't mean the sea, Mopple," said Maple gently. "I mean all this. So many things happening. Hardly any humans ever used to come up here, except for George, of course, but he wasn't really a human. He was our shepherd." Miss Maple thought for a while. "And suddenly there are whole flocks of them coming, even slinking around in the morning mist. The butcher and someone else. Of course it all links up. Did they really lure the butcher here? If so, who lured him and why? Why were the men under the lime tree afraid he'd die, although they don't like him? We must keep our eyes open for everything, Mopple. You must remember everything." Mopple raised his head. He was proud of being the flock's memory sheep. Then he remembered just why he had squeezed secretly out of the gap in the hay barn that morning. "I've remembered something already," said Mopple, and he told her how he'd been standing on the hill with Richfield, memorizing everything that Richfield saw, almost everything. Richfield had seen the four of them going away again, Gabriel, Josh, Lily, and the butcher. And he saw one of them lag a little way behind the others and bend over, picking something up, putting something down, tearing up something. And when he'd finished sneezing, he'd forgotten which of them had bent over and what that person was holding. "He just forgot," snorted Mopple pityingly. "After 3 breaths? Incredible. But he still knows he did forget something, and he's trying to intimidate me, so I won't give it away." He put his head on one side. "I wouldn't have given it away either. I like Richfield. He's the lead ram, but I think it's a clue." He looked inquiringly at Maple. She was still looking out at the dark sea. "A clue," she said thoughtfully, "but a clue to what? It's not like Richfield to go intimidating other sheep when they're telling the truth." She fell silent. "Strange," she added after a while. "Strange." Then she seemed to come to a decision. "Can you keep your mouth shut, Mopple?" she asked. Mopple shut his mouth. Maple told him about the hoof print on George's stomach. "A sheep stood on George very hard," she said, "or kicked him. Difficult to say which. The question is, when? Before his death? Perhaps. But not long before. The print was too clear for that, which means